12 Rules for What, a new podcast about the far right and right-wing politics from the perspective of the left. My name is Sam.
And I'm Alex.
And we're going to be talking today in an introductory way about what the podcast is going to do, how it's going to be structured, what are its topics, and the reason why we're going to be doing this podcast and why we think it's important. So you want to kick us off about why you think this podcast is timely?
I think there's a tendency on like the left and the anarchist left, communist left, whatever, and like a broader left that goes to the Labour Party, to think of the far right as like one huge glom of fash, and actually not to recognise that the far right movement or scene or whatever is like an interconnecting web of like relationships and antagonisms, and it's fluctuating, and there's like it is important that we understand that there are different types of fascists, and that because for one thing you fight them in different ways, but for another thing, if you just think of everyone as a Nazi, then you're kind of stuck in like, I don't know, 1930s, 1940s kind of mentality. I know that, like, for example, in like earlier decades of the 20th century, World War II was such like a huge, like, overarching weight on everybody that the kind of the fascist, anti-fascist thing still survived, and there was a lot of patriotism around beating the Nazis and stuff. And really, that's gone completely. And what we're seeing is like a lot of the liberal left being really surprised that there's such a huge amount of people willing to adopt these like reactionary ideas or racist ideas or like explicit Holocaust denial with such enthusiasm, and they don't understand where that's come from and why it's come about. And so I think what we could do is try and explain a bit of that process and explain a bit of how for example, Tommy Robinson connects to generation identity and how he connects to, you know, the forums on 4chan and Nick Land and the breadth of the right.
One of the reasons why it might also be politically useful to do that is I often find myself reading right-wing authors characterising people on the left as obsessed with identity politics or obsessed with like representation, and I don't think I'm interested really very much in either of those things. And I think that a lot of the critique from the right of the left only deals with a very small portion of the kind of total variety of left-wing thought, mostly left liberal, mostly American, mostly kind of campus-based thinking. That's mostly what it seems to me is like being critiqued when the right talk about the left. And it seems like it's very, very likely that the same thing is happening the other way around. So the idea of the podcast is to kind of explore all the kind of various formations that might be getting missed out in this analysis. The podcast is going to be structured around three different things, basically. One is going to be a set of themes. Some of those themes will be things like masculinity, technology, irony, esotericism, submission versus collectives, race, politics, that is the kind of play out of kind of intergroup violence, versus ideals. Fascism, of course, talks about its ideals a lot, but it uses violence much more than its ideals as a kind of guiding force. So there's a tension there within a lot of these thinkers and a lot of these street movements. Fascism in the environment, there's a strong eco-fascist presence in particularly places like Germany, but it's also becoming more and more of a thing around the world. Fascism's relationship to government, fascism's relationship to biology, that will tie very closely in with the environment stuff, and the way that particularly kind of soft right thinkers or alt-right thinkers or what's called the alt-light thinkers like Jordan Peterson and people on the kind of self-styled intellectual dark web use ideas from biology in order to understand the world as having a kind of natural basis and human relations as having a really natural basis in kind of physiological structure.
And that not only obviously affects things like race but also gender. Jordan Peterson made his name off like delineating a very strict gender binary and a very strict gender roles.
Precisely. And then there's going to be another theme is the archaic. Lots of fascists appeal to an extremely long time span. That's become even longer in recent ideas around, for example, right accelerationism. And there's been a kind of... classical fascists, of course, appeal to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, Evola in the 1950s and 60s was very interested in having Italian fascism return to a state of kind of Roman imperial glory. But I think there's been a sense on the right, for most people on the kind of intellectual right, that they've really lost the terrain of social history. That's been more or less completely ceded to the left. It's very obvious that history is kind of dominated as an academic practice, and also kind of in the popular understanding, at least amongst people who are politically engaged, by left-wing ideas. And so there's been an attempt by reactionaries to massively expand the field of kind of historical analysis to the entire scope of recorded time. That is, since the beginning of the universe. That's a really interesting development. I think we can talk about that a bit later.
I mean, it seems a lot of these thinkers and a lot of these like movements within the right, they're not like mass. They're quite niche.
Yeah, incredibly so.
But the important thing of the reason we need to talk about it, for one thing, is they're truly mad, and it's kind of wonderful to talk about mad things occasionally. But also, their ideas filter through this like network of relationships and antagonisms, and just like, you know, just like, for example, the anarchist scene has taken kind of a hit with the rise of Corbyn. These intellectual and forces within the right also knock on each other and kind of rub against each other and become more like each other as things go on. So, like, for example, someone like Nick Land, who is one of these right accelerationists, he is like kind of a very intellectual racist, but lives mainly in universities and now lives in Shanghai. But he has an audience, and that audience has an audience, and people take things from him that they find useful and take modes of writing and ways of expressing themselves, and that translates through to, you know, more like kind of broader street kind of stuff.
There's another aspect to that as well, which is that there's this really kind of absurd Evola line from a late book called, I think it's called Riding the Tiger, which makes it sound like a book of... it's called Ride the Tiger, which is, and modernity is the tiger. And it's a kind of a late work in which he becomes really pessimistic about the possibility of establishing fascism in Italy. And he's like, modernity is this tiger, and you can't defeat the tiger because the tiger is stronger than you. And so you can't revert to the traditional past. And so all you can do is kind of ride the tiger. And then he says, okay, well, maybe you can kind of prepare yourself in such a way that when the tiger gets tired, then you can do something, then you can fight. This is, of course, a really weird way of thinking about modernity, because, of course, modernity doesn't get tired, right? It just gets stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. At least that's been historically the tendency up until now. But one thing that might happen, and it might happen particularly in Europe and America, is that modernity, in the context of climate change over the next 50 years, might really start to slow down to the point at which like GDP like really kind of like lowers or goes down, and living standards simultaneously like go down, and that's going to lead to, combined with, you know, the mass desertification of like North Africa and Central Africa, is going to lead to like mass migration, and that's going to lead to like a much more explicit racist politics in Europe, trying to defend Europe against kind of mass migration. So these ideas, I think, will only become more important, although they seem esoteric now, although they seem like they have almost no purchase now. Over the next 50 years, I think fascism is going to have a serious, quite terrifying revival.
The second part of the podcast, we're going to be talking about more concrete examples of like fascist groups or far-right groups and street movements. And we'll take each week or every episode we do one of them, we'll take someone like Tommy Robinson or the Proud Boys or Generation Identity and kind of do an explainer on them, basically, and show where they come from, where they might be going, what their kind of influence is, and how, I guess, how relevant they are to the left and anti-fascists, because there's a tendency to think that everyone has the same amount of influence and everyone has the same need to be opposed, and oftentimes anti-fascists spend their days running around after a group of 3 middle-aged alcoholics, and leaving like the much more dangerous and insidious kind of influential stuff, and kind of dismissing it to be on like corners of 4chan or the internet, and not worth kind of fighting in any way.
We should probably talk at this point about what we mean by the right. We can list people, and I think maybe that's a good way of beginning, at least. We can list people who we think are on the right, and people can imagine connections between those people. But we can also say that there's like quite a clear lineage here from a set of really quite well-defined ideas, starting maybe with the New Right in France in the 1960s, late 1960s. In January 1968, there's a conference of people on the far right, what's called the New Right, including people who we're going to be talking very explicitly, like William Fay, who wrote a thing called Why We Fight, which then became the kind of textbook for generation identity. And so there is a lineage that comes more or less from essentially quite a small collection of thinkers in France.
And yeah, and what we're seeing now is kind of a confluence of a few of those lineages. So William Fay was, before 9/11, William Fay was writing a lot about Muslims and the encroaching kind of Islamic migration, Islamic takeover of Europe. And 9/11 really did light a fire in that kind of strand of thinking. In a way, he was ahead of his time in foreseeing this as an exploitable issue by the far right. And out of 9/11, we got obviously like increased wars and surveillance and more repressive state apparatuses. But it gave birth to quite a DIY counter-jihad movement, which sprung up pretty quickly after the fall of the Twin Towers. And what we're seeing now is kind of a mixture of like, so for example, someone like Tommy Robinson definitely comes out of like a far-right hooligan tradition, but he also comes out of the counter-jihad movement, which was a lot of what the EDL was about when it was really at its height, and what he's trying to make all these like kind of citizen journalist work since. But he's also taking influence from Generation Identity and their strand of thinking, and he met with the leader of Generation Identity when that guy was still allowed in the UK, and it isn't inconceivable that he could become much more of a presence in that group, although he's finding much more kind of purchase in the kind of independent campaigning that he's really kind of perfected to a large extent.
The conference I mentioned a moment ago was called the GRECE, and this is the New Right conference in France. And it was kind of superseded by a thing called the Club in 1974. And the idea was basically that what was called metapolitics, the idea of the New Right was that they would engage in metapolitics, is basically a very kind of slow culture war, that they would transform the culture of France and Europe more generally, and by extension America, slowly and eventually over like a long period of time would like prepare it for the return of fascism. Obviously in France, being kind of Vichyist, or being like a person who had been a Nazi collaborator, was still poisonous as like a political standpoint, and so they kind of more or less explicitly rejected this, but they thought they could take a much, much longer route back to power. And although the culture wars are no longer quite as kind of explicitly intense as they were perhaps maybe 25 years ago, they're now returning to that. And it'd be interesting, I think, also to think about some people who don't explicitly identify as right-wing, like, for example, Jordan Peterson, who is a figure not necessarily explicitly advocating a return of fascism, but nevertheless who forms a really important component in the massification of a cultural transition back to essentially reactionary conceptions of the self, or reactionary conceptions of gender in particular. This is a part of the New Right strategy, even if Jordan Peterson doesn't realise it and wouldn't explicitly support it.
Yeah, it's like, especially with someone like Peterson, it's not like he would very much profess to be, against anti-Semitism and against all these things, describe himself as a classical liberal, but he has been empowered by a certain movement and a certain kind of sympathetic subset of mainstream society, and that has been leapt upon by a lot of these people, like Gwilym Fai and people we're going to talk about more. So yeah, it doesn't have to. You don't have to be intending something to be an avatar for it, and that's really important to say straight up, because otherwise people go, "Well, I'm not that, and therefore that's not what I'm doing." And an important part of analysing these things is there's a separate intention and actual causation, I think.
But in the meantime, and kind of as support for that, we thought we might suggest some things for people to kind of go away and read. There's some pretty short articles out there that are actually extremely useful for thinking about the kind of what's happening on the far right. Josephine Armistead wrote a thing called the Silicon Ideology. It's about 10 pages long.
It's on archive.org, so
yes.
It's freely available.
Very available. And that very neatly summarises a whole load of theories of fascism. It summarises Bodiga's theory, Deleuze and Guattari's, Trotsky's, a theory put about by someone called Scott H. It's very, very useful.
Also, the main body of the article is like a intellectual history of where the neo-reactionary movement came from, and it is really useful to kind of get an idea of the melding of different streams of different cultures and streams of thought into this one thing. And so it draws from pop culture, like Warhammer 40k and things like that, which would played a big part in the kind of reactionary imaginary in building kind of an authoritarian world in people's heads. But yeah, it's good. People should read it. The whole thing about 40k is that the universe is fucking miserable. Everything's scarce. Humanity has kind of organised itself into a extremely ruthless hierarchical society ruled over by an absent god emperor who keeps the galaxy together with his psychic powers. And there's no nice place within this universe. Everything is shit. Everything is decaying, and
it's a kind of conflict for resources between groups of racially distinct people who could not possibly come to an agreement on anything at all.
Yeah, all sci-fi and fantasy fiction is inherently racist, and it should be opposed at all costs.
That's Alex is speaking there in a personal capacity. It's not the view of the podcast. Okay, we're going to be releasing podcasts, we hope, every 2 weeks on those three topics. So themes in fascism, individual or groups of fascists or groups of people on the far right, and anti-fascism, rotating around those three topics.
12 rules.